We're here at McBurney Park, where children play, people walk their dogs, and the maples reach to the sky. But as the sun sets and the moon comes out, the locals simply call it Skeleton Park. You see, beneath the benches, trees, and grass lie the remains of up to 10,000 people. Join us as we investigate the legend, lore, and history of what led to a mass burial in one of Canada's oldest cities. A park where some believe the dead walk among the living.
It's been a park for quite a few years now. It was originally a cemetery that was established here probably by the 1820s at least, and it was used up until the 1850s and possibly into the 1860s, at which time it was closed. It was actually derelict for quite some time until 1893, when complaints about the condition of the cemetery were so enormous, and the city decided to actually do something about that, and it was decided to make it into a park. The earliest map that the Garrison Burial Ground appears on is that 1814 to 1816 period. So we don't have any evidence prior to that. We know it does relate only to the British period and British occupation, and that essentially starts in the 1780s. 1783 is when the British occupation begins here. So we know it cannot date any earlier than that.
The first remains that were buried here were thought to have been soldiers. There was a garrison in this area, and there was a number of epidemics that Kingston was afflicted by. The biggest ones were 1832 to 1834. An estimated 10% of Kingstonians died. And 1847, an estimated 50,000 Irish came through Kingston. They were fleeing what's known as Angorta Mór, or the Great Hunger, also known as the Potato Famine. An estimated 300 Kingstonians died helping the Irish, who were carrying the typhus at that time, and they were buried in this area. Between 1813 and 1865, there were an estimated 10,000 remains buried in this area. Many of them, or most of them, were either Irish or Scottish, and that was a direct reflection of the Kingston community at that time.
The original name when it was actually turned into the park was Frontenac Park, and the name was changed to McBurney named after the first principal, I think it was the first principal of Central Public School. But its traditional name around Kingston is actually Skeleton Park. I'm not absolutely sure when the last burial was. We know they certainly slowed down in the 1850s, but there may have been some in the 1860s, but certainly by 1864 there were no more burials in the cemetery.
So it was decided in 1893 to actually turn this area into a park. The remains were to be removed up to either Cataraqui Cemetery or St. Mary's Cemetery. There were several conditions laid out as to how the area was dealt with. Headstones were to be laid low. There was to be no walks over any of the remains, and there were several other conditions attached to this area becoming a park. One of those, in fact, was that a commemoration monument was to be erected as well.
The center of it's always changed. Like when we were younger, the center of the park was almost like a dome with rocks. So it was all done so the rocks were flat, so you could ride right over it with your bike. That's why I remember it was flat, because you could just ride right on over it. And then they redid it so the rocks stuck out over top of the motor, so you couldn't ride over it. So because I think kids got hurt doing it, maybe that's why they did it. I don't know, but they changed it. But more kids got hurt on it when it got. You know what I mean? So it doesn't make sense. Why would they dig it up? We used to hear rumors that was where they threw the mass amount of bodies in the park. That was the pit where they put all the cholera and the victims from that. That's what we heard. And then later on, they dug it up twice. Why would they do that? And they never said anything. They never stated anything. The only thing that we ever really saw was the man that was dug up on the corner of the park. We could see his coffin. We were younger, we went over there and looked at that. That was like one of the big big things about Skeleton Park because we never believed it when we were kids. Like, yeah, right, it was a graveyard. And then, sure enough, they dig up a coffin on the side of the road, and you're like, yeah, it was a graveyard.
It became a park in 1893, so it is over 100 years old. And certainly it's well used. We see it very well used as a park. And I would think, based on the historical information we've looked at from that time period, from 1893 and the period when they were changing it over, it certainly was something that residents were pleased with and were glad to see happen because the cemetery was in such disrepair at that time.
A Mr. Adfit was contracted by the city to remove the remains. However, the work stopped in 1894 for several reasons. Two of the main reasons were that one of the conditions laid out by the city was that a family had to request remains be removed to one of those two cemeteries. However, one of the difficulties with epidemics is that several times whole families would have been wiped out, so there were no relatives to ask for the remains to be moved to one of the other two cemeteries. The other reason is that in that time period it was thought that disease was spread by air. So there was a great concern whenever these graves were opened that the diseases would in fact spread to local people.
When it's foggy out and misty out, it smells a sewer rotten stank. And it's not sewer gas because I've smelled sewer gas before. It's something else. And it's nasty. And you can smell it. Especially, I noticed it's by the cannon really bad. That's where it ranks the most to me. I would guess it's the bodies in the park that they didn't take because that was the story, and it's true. It has to be true because they found a man in the side of the road. If they took the bodies, then the man wouldn't be in the side of the road.
There certainly was concern that was expressed as to whether or not there would be problems with diseases coming out of the ground. We have to remember that at that time, which was 1893, certainly medical advances were not the way they are today. There was still not a lot of knowledge as to how these diseases were picked up, how different people got sick and others did not get sick. There was a lot of uncertainty about that, and certainly the concern was there. However, we know now that that probably was unfounded and there was no danger of spreading any of these diseases through the community.
Quite often with contagious diseases, people were buried as quickly as possible. So it's not unusual all along the St. Lawrence there to find that there are unmarked graves. Certainly all along the Rideau Canal, there's unmarked graves all the way along there. Contagious diseases were not well understood, and people couldn't be buried fast enough, and it was not unusual for immigrants to be buried in unmarked graves.